With me now is Gabriel Hetland, Assistant Professor of Latin American Studies at the State University of New York at Albany. He joins us now from Rochester, New York via Skype. So Gabriel, a lot can happen between now and then, but this election later this month, could that be a tipping point? Can we see a civil war in this country?
I sure hope not. I think that there's plenty to criticize on both sides, and I think that the decision to call the Constituent Assembly is something that we can certainly question, and I don't particularly think it was a great idea. We'll see if any good proposals come out of it, but the opposition as well has really been escalating its protests and has unfortunately been engaging in violent protests quite a bit. So temperatures need to go down on both sides, and I really think a dialogue and a negotiated solution is the only path forward for the Venezuelan people right now. So having the Constituent Assembly or an opposition-controlled government that doesn't come to power through constitutional means would both be wrong moves, in my opinion.
You mentioned dialogue. How do all the sides get to that point?
It's going to be really tricky. The Pope has called for dialogue repeatedly. There's been certain moments over the last couple of years where there's been possibilities for dialogue. The beginning of 2014, for instance, where the more moderate factions of the opposition were starting to discuss certain things with Maduro at that point. Right now, it's going to be very, very hard. I think the government needs to show some seriousness about it, but the opposition also needs to show much, much more respect for life, respect for property, state property, respect for the dignity of the popular sectors who, by and large, are really frustrated with the government, but are not showing signs of joining the violent protests or even the not-so-violent protests. So it's going to be hard, but I think that that's where energy should be going, not towards regime change, and not towards sort of unconditional support for the government. Neither of those options seem suitable.
So if President Maduro decided not to hold that election later this month, could that be a starting point?
Sure. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, Leopoldo Lopez was released to house arrest, so he's still under arrest, but that was seen by some as a sort of token sign from the government that it's willing to engage in some conciliatory measures, and I think it was a good sign. I doubt that the government would agree not to hold the vote on July 30th, but the way in which both sides react during that period and after that period, I think could be very important for the future of the country.
Let's take a look at the serious issues that Venezuela is dealing with. If you take out the government and the protesters here, what would it take to turn the country around, and how long would it take?
We're talking about years. It's not going to be an easy process. It's not going to be a quick fix. On the economic front, and that's really the crux of many of the issues right now, there needs to be much more production happening in Venezuela because they still rely very, very heavily on imports for food, medicine, and basic goods. There needs to be a major reform of the currency. Economists from across the political spectrum in Venezuela, in the United States, and throughout the world have been calling for a free float of the bolivar, the Venezuelan currency, for a number of years. That still is very necessary, and doing that would eliminate other problems, or at least reduce them, in terms of dramatic amounts of corruption and a loss of state funds through public officials and also through the private sector. So that's one of the critical moves. And the more medium and long-term, Venezuela needs to move away from oil dependency, which is a long-standing issue that the country has suffered from for decades. In order to make the possibility of economic reform a reality, there really does need to be a cooling of temperatures. And I know in the mainstream media in the United States and in much of the world, all of the blame goes towards the government. And I think that's wrong. The government deserves some of the blame. They're certainly not scot-free, but the opposition also deserves its share of the blame. The opposition has engaged in truly atrocious protests. They've burned a number of people alive. They have ransacked government property. They've destroyed food that could go to people who are hungry right now. So unless the opposition shows a much more serious attitude towards peace and towards a nonviolent approach, it's going to be very difficult to move forward. And I think that there needs to be a very strong, forthright criticism of both sides, not only the government, as we too often hear in the U.S. media.
All right, Gabriel Hetland in Rochester, New York, thank you for your insight.